Today's podcast is brought to you by the Bioceuticals Integrative Oncology Workshop with Dr. Lise Altschuler. This full-day program will run between the dates of the 20th and 28th of July across Melbourne, Sydney, Gold Coast, Adelaide and Perth. The intensive class will explore key concepts and therapeutic integrative strategies for breast, prostate, colon and lung cancers, as well as how to support toxicities associated with conventional treatment. By the end of the day, you'll be able to confidently implement this important aspect of patient care into your clinical practice. For more information and to register for this critical event, please visit the Bioceuticals website at bioceuticals.com.au. This is FX Radio and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. And with me on the line all the way from near Chicago in the USA is Stacey Roberts. Now, as I've mentioned in a previous podcast, Stacey is a former physiotherapist turned herbalist and naturopath. She's been involved in the healthcare system since 1989 in both conventional and complementary medicine. She's an internationally recognised natural fertility expert. She's well published. She appears on TV programs around the world. So, Stacey, welcome back to FX Radio.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Stacey, let's jump right in to the subject. Tell me what the prevalence is of thyroid issues in infertile women.
Well, when you're talking about thyroid issues, we really have to break it up into two separate diagnoses that are out there. There's the hypothyroidism, which is the slow or kind of sluggish thyroid, the slowing down the thyroid gland where it's not creating, or it may be creating the amount of hormone that we need, but it's not converting it well, or it's not creating the amount of thyroid hormone that we need. Yep. And then there's hyperthyroidism, where they're creating too much of the hormone, of the thyroid hormone that can create problems. So if you're looking at the prevalence of just hypothyroidism in women in their reproductive years, it's somewhere between 2 and 4%. When you look at women who are diagnosed with fertility issues, specifically unexplained fertility, the prevalence can vary from 0.5%, depending on what study you're looking at, so all the way up to 25%, depending on the subjects that are looked at in different studies.
Wow. And
now hyperthyroidism is less evident in the population in general, where it's about 2.3% in the women in their reproductive years. It's about 1%. Can I start over with the hyperthyroidism? The prevalence of hyperthyroidism in women in their reproductive years in the general population is about 1%, whereas with the women in their dealing with fertility issues, it's about 2.3%. So you've got an increased incidence of both issues when it comes to thyroid. So it's definitely a big issue. And then you have the issue where we look at subclinical hypothyroid or thyroid that may be within the normal range, but not really producing an optimal level for that person's particular fertility. And there's really no stats on that. So, those stats can certainly be a lot higher.
With the issue with hypothyroidism, that's a really wide variance, isn't it? Any reasons for that?
Absolutely. I think it depends on the study and what diagnoses they're looking at. So they may have lumped polycystic ovaries into that, or anyone who's been diagnosed with any type of fertility issue, or some of the studies maybe just looking at unexplained, fertility issues. So I think it depends on the study and what they're particularly looking at, and unfortunately they're not always very clear.
So what are some of the symptoms that practitioners should be looking for to maybe, flag underactive thyroid?
Well, the most common things that people will see, and as the patients are Googling on the internet, when they'll say, hey, I think I have this issue, is that their fatigue is a big issue with hypothyroidism. Very tired. And some women, they'll have unexplained weight gain or lots of difficulty losing weight, even if they're eating well or exercising. Other things potentially will be looking at their thyroid, feeling their thyroid in their neck, and it's actually swollen. looking a bit wider. That can be both hyper and hypo, but oftentimes you'll see almost a goiter forming in hypothyroid women. Some creases along the neck, some very deep creases along the neck can be also something that you would see. But generally, how women feel is just very sluggish, very tired, and just generally don't feel like they've got much gas or petrol in their petrol tank.
What about the other classical symptoms like losing the outer third of the eyebrow and things like that? How prevalent do you find those? How helpful?
In fertility, I only see those in someone who's been dealing with hypothyroidism for a long time. That's not something that I see very often, but it does happen. The other things that we see related to the menstrual cycle are they may be missing their periods, long cycles, bleeding excessively, bleeding heavily with lots of clotting. All these different things can make us go, okay, maybe there's a thyroid issue here that we need to look at. And just stepping in with the fertility diagnosis should automatically make you, as a practitioner, want to assess the thyroid for optimal function.
Can I just go into one of the symptoms that you mentioned there about excessive periods with lots of clotting? I thought that was more of an inflammatory type process. So you're saying it's linked to thyroid disease as well, or linked to thyroid disease instead of?
It's something that I see commonly with women with thyroid issues, any type of change in their menstrual flow. Now, again, with anything that we're talking about, Andrew, a lot of these things are overlapping. So a woman with endometriosis might come in with clotting issues. A woman who is insulin resistant, that's dealing with polycystic ovaries, and like you're saying, has an inflammatory reaction in their system, may also present with that. But I've also seen that as one of the indicators for women who are dealing with hypothyroid. But everyone's very individual.
Yeah,
we have to remember not to slot even symptoms in specific disease or imbalance categories.
No, that's great. Thank you for clarifying that. It just piqued my interest there. What about the symptoms of overactive thyroid, Graves' disease, for instance?
The overactive thyroid will again accompany, what will accompany overactive thyroid is, again, fatigue. Many people just feel really tired, but the difference oftentimes between that and hypothyroid is oftentimes people feel as though it's like their foot's on the petrol pedal, to go, but they just don't have the energy they just are just feeling really fatigued. Yeah. But they feel like they're utilizing a lot of energy. Also, diarrhea, rapid or sudden weight loss, feeling nauseous, unwell. The particular Graves' disease, oftentimes we'll see the bulging of the eyes. Those types of things are prevalent. Long-term Graves' disease will have the swelling in the area of the tibia and discoloration in the area of the tibia on their legs.
So, sorry, can I just cut in there? Something that I've never heard of here, discoloration of the tibia and swelling. Can you explain that further, please, Stacey?
Sure. It's a sign or symptom of someone who's had longer-term Graves' disease. It's called pretibial myxedema. And you'll notice that on the front of the lower leg, there'll be some discoloration or a non-pitting edema that they'll find in the front of the leg. Again, not something that from a fertility standpoint I typically would see because these are usually, someone who's coming to me with Graves' disease that's been trying to get pregnant is usually they've been diagnosed and well monitored and taken care of. But these are some things that a practitioner might see in someone with long-standing Graves' disease.
Wow. Okay. And so other signs and symptoms?
I think we went over the diarrhea, the bulging of the eyes, and also the goiter, as we talked about. It could be either hypo or hypothyroidism for that.
And what about causes for both underactive and overactive thyroid?
There's so many different potential causes. One of the ones that we hear about often, and that's treated often, is either lack of iodine, so iodine deficiency, or excessive iodine. So either one can be an issue. So for hypothyroidism, typically, if there's iodine deficiency, then you're not going to be making the T4 hormone, which is the primary hormone in the thyroid gland, that is then broken down to T3 and T2 and T1 and T0. So iodine deficiency can be an issue. The other issue is excessive iodine, which can throw somebody into hyperthyroid. That's a lot less prevalent in our society. We tend, in Australia especially, women and children tend to be iodine deficient, according to a 2006 study. So that's much less prevalent in the Australian.
There's a massive call here, and indeed the National Health and Medical Research Council has set out a guideline, a public health guideline since January 2010, that all pregnant women should be receiving a supplement as well as us having the fortified food, because in pregnancy those demands exceed the amount that's available from food.
That's correct, and there's been studies. There's also studies out there showing that in breast milk of pregnant, after the women have had the babies, breast milk levels of iodine are too low to really support the infant's thyroid function as well too.
Yeah.
So it has a knock-on effect after birth as well too.
What about the issue of potential iodine excess? Because it's a real concern. There was a scare here with a certain soy milk that really did have an issue. Is there a real issue of women receiving too much iodine?
Andrew, the only times that I've seen that in the clinic over a decade of working with women with fertility issues has been when some of the Asian population who naturally have higher iodine levels in the foods that they're eating. They're eating a lot of seaweed, or if somebody eats a lot of sushi, then potentially they've felt very unwell on additional iodine supplementation that has been in, let's say, a multivitamin. I would narrowed it down that was the only thing different from another multivitamin that they had been taking that didn't have the iodine in it.
Right.
Or if they were taking iodine supplementation, unbeknownst to myself, and then increased, let's say, the amount of seaweed that they had in their diet. One woman was actually chewing on seaweed and felt really nauseous, and her T4 levels just shot through the roof. So the prevalence of it, I don't see it very often in the clinic, to be honest. But I think we have to look at different cultures and how their ways of eating, and we have to assess each person's food diary to see what levels of iodine they're potentially getting from different foods in their diet. And it can be, like I said, in the fortified foods, you have iodine in eggs. There's all sorts of different sources, but the biggest one that I've seen is the source of seaweed.
Yeah. So do you have cause for prescribing let's say a multivitamin without iodine? Because it seems like the market catches on to flavours of the month and then everything's included, and it doesn't take into account though where you might be getting that supplement from an external source as well. Right.
The only time that I again would look at that is if somebody is having excessive iodine or what I would say would be more than the average person amount of iodine in their diet. But I would, instead of trying to find a supplement, as you said, nowadays, because after that study came out in regards to the deficiency in women, it's hard to find a prenatal without iodine in it, at least in the good ones that I see out there. Mm-hmm. So I would ask them to be adjusting their eating plan as well, versus getting away from just looking for a supplement that doesn't have any iodine in it, because it's certainly beneficial for sure, and their needs once they become pregnant are really important as well to be on the additional iodine.
The no adverse effect limit is set at no observable adverse effect limit, no AL, is set at 1100 micrograms. Do you find that a reasonable set point to be as a maximum for iodine intake, or do you find no issue with even far higher intakes?
In my the way that I utilize my formulations in regards to the herbs and then supplementation, I've never found it necessary to go that high of a supplementation for iodine. Potentially around, if a good multivitamin would probably have around 300 micrograms of the potassium iodine in it. I look at, on top of that, only if they're iodine deficient based on 24-hour urinary iodine test, or potentially very low T4 levels in combination with herbs like withania and bacopa, which have been shown to support T4 levels have been shown to be related to an increase in T4 levels once taken. I'll do that in combination with additional iodine, and then, of course, work with the doctor on testing T4 levels and make sure that they're stabilizing where we want them to be optimal for pregnancy. So I've really never gone above that 1100 microgram limit. I know that there's people out there that do, but that's just not something that I've had to do to optimize thyroid function.
For the listeners, I would probably direct you to an interesting an argument between Dr. Alan Gabby and Dr. Guy Abrahams, and it's this tete-a-tete that they're having about the dose, the appropriate dose. So moving on, it's interesting, some recent papers that have come out, one in particular by Drutal, mentioning selenium, and it's sort of, dare I say the sentence, it appears to make iodine safer, quote unquote. The Drutal paper is using it in orbitopathy with hyperthyroid. What's your take on selenium and how appropriate to find it? What doses do you use?
Selenium is absolutely essential when dealing with overall health and specifically thyroid and immune function. Selenium allows the T4 levels that we're creating or one of the nutrients, I should say, that encourages the conversion of T4 to T3, and T3 being the more active of the two hormones going around and really influencing every cell in the body and helping to make progesterone. Helping to stimulate the body to make progesterone and also testosterone as well. So again, really, really important mineral that also acts as an antioxidant. And I think that's one of the reasons why, like you said, the quote was, it makes iodine safer. Well, if you're increasing your T4 levels by increasing iodine, you don't want the T4 to just be building up and then not converting into active T3. So it's possible that selenium supplementation is encouraging the balance of that conversion to help support optimal hormone balance down the chain.
And what dosage do you use there, Stacey?
I tend to go up to, in Australia, 150 micrograms of selenium as the limit that's allowable in Australia. There are other countries where they go up to 200 micrograms, where studies have supported that allowance in the multivitamins that they're selling in those other countries. So I would say somewhere between 150 to 200 micrograms is the safe dose, because as we know, selenium can be toxic at high doses taken for long periods of time. So we want to be cognizant of that, but we also want to be able to, give our patients what they need in regards to that support for T4 and T3, because someone could be presenting with hypothyroidism with a normal TSH level, a normal T4 level, but if they're presenting with the symptoms or some of the issues with fertility or some of the symptoms that we talked about previously, that conversion of T4 to T3 may not be happening simply because they don't have those nutrients in their system to convert that T4 to T3 and then have the knock-on effect of optimizing the reproductive hormone levels too.
Right. And do you find any difference in the different types of selenium that are available on the market? For instance, selenomethionine versus sodium selenite?
I personally have seen better effects from supplementation that have had the selenomethionine in it. I don't know if that's because of the quality of the supplements that I tend to use usually have that form of selenium in. I can't speak to that specifically, but I do know that the supplements that I recommend utilize that type of selenium, and I've seen some great results with it. Yeah.
And, living in our 21st century toxic world, what part do you find, toxins, chemicals, and indeed pre-existing medications might play in the reason for having an overactive or underactive thyroid?
Any type of inflammation, either caused by, poor eating plan, chemical exposure, toxic exposure, is going to have an impact on the thyroid gland for sure. That's, clear in the research. So when we're exposed to herbicides, pesticides, things like that in the foods that we're eating, if we're, exposed to heavy metals on our, jobs that we're doing, anything like that, or, mercury fillings that used to be popular in dentistry, all those types of things can certainly impact the thyroid in a huge way, and then also decrease the ability of that T4 to convert into T3. And we know that these chemical and toxins, and even inflammation from things like being sensitive or intolerant to gluten, can create inflammation that also is impacting our immune system, which then can lead us to an autoimmune disease of something like Hashimoto's disease.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really important for practitioners to know in regards to fertility is many times we've read in school that and doctors are taught that thyroid antibodies be elevated or won't be an issue, or Hashimoto's disease won't be an issue if the TSH levels are normal. And that just simply is not true. There's studies showing that normal TSH, normal T4 levels in women can also be associated with elevated thyroid antibody levels and the beginnings of Hashimoto's disease. So that's something that, again, chemicals, what we're putting in our body, what our body's surrounded by, is certainly impacting our autoimmune system as well as our thyroid for sure.
And that plays into just what an effective pump the thyroid is, isn't it? The Hashimotos can actually present as euthyroid because the thyroid is such an efficient manufacturer of thyroid hormone that you don't really see a drop-off until a lot of damage has occurred. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. And many times patients will come to me and say, oh, my physician said that my thyroid antibodies were elevated, but not to worry because there's nothing you can do about it until the thyroid fails, and then we'll put you on medication. And that never sits well with anyone, really. I mean, if I've heard that
Strangely.
once, I've heard it 100 times. Exactly. So why don't we want to, before it fails, to try to adjust that? And I think that the belief is, conventionally that you can't do anything. There's nothing that you can do. It just happens, the luck of the draw, yada, yada. But there's certainly many things that can be done. Something as simple as removing gluten from the diet has significantly decreased patients' thyroid antibodies and created, a lessening of symptoms and improvement in fertility and decrease in miscarriage. Again, that's all been documented. Even utilizing thyroxine has been documented to decrease miscarriage rate in women who've had elevated thyroid antibodies by 50%. So it's just, there's a huge amount of research that just isn't being talked about or discussed that needs to get out there.
To me, that's such an interesting mindset for that practitioner to say that. It's kind of like, okay, so you've just been diagnosed with diabetes, so let's get you set up for a leg prosthesis now because you're going to lose your feet sooner or later anyway. So.
Right. Yeah. I think it's a matter of, if it's not what they would consider a disease state, which is, defined in the books that they use to define that, then they're not going to treat it. Your glucose levels, fasting glucose or HbA1c might be, right at the high end of normal, but they're not going to treat that until it becomes diabetes. So let's just wait until you get diabetes before we do something about it.
Yeah.
Which again is not a holistic.
No.
Not looking at a preventative point of view at all. But that unfortunately is the attitude out there among some physicians. Thankfully, not all. There's some very good proactive physicians that want to prevent those issues from happening as well too. So,
and that's where I was going to go with my next question. Is obviously you found these practitioners, but how hard is it, and what's different about these people? Like, are they the questioners? Like, why is this happening, or how did you meet them? I
think it's people who, when you present them with the evidence, I mean, I believe, and I didn't go through medical school, so I can't speak to this, but I can just say that what physicians have said to me is that, they're taught basically that if TSH is normal, then the likelihood of thyroid antibodies being elevated is pretty close to zero. So I remember a talk that I had with one physician when I was asking for thyroid antibodies to be tested, even though TSH was normal. And he was very argumentative to me about that and explained to me why that's not possible. So the patient paid out of pocket to have it done themselves through a pathology lab and came back elevated. And I just presented that to him with the information that about the miscarriage rates and things like that with people who have urothyroid but elevated thyroid antibodies. And I certainly didn't get a thank you note from him, but I certainly did get patients who were referred to me, down the road from him. So sometimes it's just presenting the information that they haven't seen before. And other times it is that they're questioning people, that they say, this just doesn't make sense. Why would we wait if there's a disease process starting? Why don't we want to stop that from progressing? So I think it just depends on the individual person.
Talking about individual people living in the 21st century again, how big a factor do you find that dealing with our chronic stressful lifestyles is in this whole picture of thyroid issues?
It's huge. I mean, when you look at, physiological stress on the system, which is caused by something physiological going on, maybe it's something that we're eating that's disagreeing with us, for example, gluten or dairy or sugar, that's creating this inflammation in our system, or physical stress from outside the body that's creating emotional stress. And then that's causing physiological stress by the way that we're perceiving that stress and how we're dealing with it. All that affects our cortisol levels and bring in the stress that's on the immune system and the autoimmune system, causing autoimmune diseases as well, which are running rampant just for general health, not just underlying infertility.
Sure. And, when we're talking about stress, we always really should be talking about stressors, but then it becomes overwhelming. So how do you tease those apart, the physical stressors, the physiological stressors, and the emotional stressors?
Sure. It's all in really talking to the patient, getting to know the patient, getting to know what's happening in the patient's lives. So it's not just about what their symptoms are. It's about getting to know the person behind the piece of paper, the person behind the diagnosis. What's the relationship like? What was their upbringing? What are they doing right now? Are they studying? Are they, it often seems that people come in and they're studying full time, they're working full time, and they're renovating 2 homes at the same time, or that they've have so much stress in their system, or they just went through divorce, they're remarried, and they have 3 kids from the other. It's just so many things in their lives that we have to take into consideration, and then we can all just say to them, "Oh, you're stressed. You just need to, de-stress." But they look at you like, "Are you kidding me? What do you mean? I can't, stop doing these things or that thing." So you really have to work with the person as they're presenting themselves and really create a partnership between you and that person sitting across the table from you. Really learn about them and listen to them, what they're dealing with, and then help them create something that will work for their particular situation. So I could say to, somebody who's renovating a house, well, stop renovating. You're exposed to all these chemicals, you're doing all this stuff. What's more important, having a baby or renovating this house? Well, how is that fair to them? So we want to work with them and say, okay, well, are you exposed to these different things? How can you minimize your exposure? What can you do? What can you do to decrease your stress in other areas of your life? And just create the plan that's individual to their situation. So we tease out the normal stressors that we know are common, but then we have to look at that individual person and see what their situation is presenting with and how we can support them in this partnership that we're creating, support them through that process.
Yeah. And you've been doing this for a number of years now, obviously, but have you found a dramatic increase in the amount of emotional load that people are carrying?
Absolutely. I used to coach high school age girls, and I did that for about 20 years. Yeah. And the biggest change that I saw in them is the amount of stress that they had to deal with over time. And that just goes and equates with the amount of stress that the parents are dealing with, the stress that you and I are experiencing, just with all of the technology that's available to us, the stressors that we're dealing with, from trying to manage our emails to our text messages to our, everything that we're trying to manage. We've just created so many more tigers chasing after us.
Yeah.
And also small stressors that are building up over a period of time. So absolutely, without a doubt, people are dealing with more stress and different types of stress than they were, let's say, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Certainly they had stress back then, but we're just much more bombarded these days. And just having fertility issues in itself is stressful. So that's just another thing that's plopped on top of the whole heap of stress that people are dealing with.
And I've got to say, women are so hard on themselves and each other. It's
and some of that is really coming from the conditioning that we have out there of, why didn't you try earlier? Women who are over 35 think their eggs are running out, tomorrow, because that's what they hear in the media and read. But, when you look at the actual statistics out there, women between 35 and 39 are having the most babies in Australia and more in the westernized countries.
Oh, wow.
So women are getting, oh yeah, absolutely. And women are getting beat up. They're basically, feeling guilty for not having fallen in love with somebody earlier, and wanting to have babies earlier. They may have met somebody at 38 and they're like, oh gosh, this is too late. And that's just not true. So they are themselves, but it's oftentimes a society or a conditioning thing that we kind of beat up ourselves, and we take all this responsibility on ourselves that we somehow are at fault for the fertility issues. And that's really not the point. The real point is not pointing out who's at fault, blaming someone. It's about saying, look, it's time to take responsibility for your overall health. Dealing with fertility issues is a sign of an imbalance in the system. There may be a diagnosis such as polycystic ovaries, which is easy to hang your hat on. What to do in regards to that. But a lot of times it's unexplained fertility issues, or they're saying it's age-related. Well, we want to take responsibility for our own overall health so that we can optimize our hormone balance or any other underlying imbalances that are created or that we've created over time. Again, it's not about blaming. It's just about stepping back and taking responsibility. I know this information now, so I'm going to do better. I'm going to improve my diet. I'm going to decrease my exposure to toxins. I'm going to really pay attention to what I'm putting in and on my body and just start taking responsibility for those types of things and looking at overall health, which prepares us for having children and then having healthy families as well.
Yeah. Beautifully said. And I'd like to point out to the listeners, something that you said earlier really, really piqued my interest. You said, we have created so many tigers that chase us now with technology and the demands that we place on ourselves and, all of the financial stresses of keeping up with the Joneses. And well said. So well said. So, Stacey, let's move on to what you do now for these people that are chronically stressed, chronically worn out. It's not as easy as just saying, look, don't beat yourself up. What therapies do you actually employ to help these people cope with the stressors of modern day living?
Well, the first thing that I do and that I always strive to do with my patients is to help them understand what the stress is doing and help them understand that they may be stressed even though they don't feel stressed. For example, some people come in and say, I'm doing this, this, and this. I have this problem, but I don't feel stressed. So I don't understand how you can say my adrenals have any issues or my hormones are out because of that. But then I talk to them about, we have all these, tigers that are chasing us that we've created. And that for some people really increases their stress threshold, meaning they can tolerate a lot of stress emotionally because they've trained themselves to do so. But physiologically, there's signs that things are out of balance, or whether it's a hormone imbalance or a skin condition or fertility issues or whatever it presents itself with. So then I'll sit down and I'll diagram out, these are your adrenals, this is your thyroid, your adrenals are like your petrol tank, your thyroid is like your engine, and I'll show them the relationship between the two and how the thyroid hormone impacts reproductive hormones, and then the adrenals can kind of steal away your progesterone, which is obviously one of the reproductive hormones. If there's elevated levels of cortisol, progesterone is utilized to make more cortisol. So I'll explain the process to them, which I think is lacking in quick doctor's appointments. So when you can sit down and show them on a piece of paper exactly what's going on, the light bulb starts to go on.
Yeah.
And then you show them based on their blood tests and based on, what we've seen in the clinic with our patients over the years and how they compare to them. I think people then become empowered again because they before didn't think they could do anything about this stuff because they said, this is just what it is. It is what it is, and there's really nothing you can do about it. And they become very disempowered when they receive this information. So, before I even start with herbs or give any type of modalities for them to do or to practice, I want to educate them and help them learn about what their body does so that they then take ownership and say, look, okay, then I can do these. So these things will help influence that. And that's where we work together to create the plan. So from stress management point of view, exercise is great for stress management. So we work on what's realistic in regards to an exercise program for them, or I might refer them out to a personal trainer or a physiotherapist to help support them depending on their situation. Yep. Then we look at things like yoga and meditation. We talk about, starting off with visualization. If you can't get your monkey mind to settle down and relax and quiet, which is totally, which is very common for people out there. They have difficulty settling their mind. Yeah. We start with just visualization, relaxation exercises, looking at ways that they can do this for 5 minutes a day or 30 minutes a day, whatever works with their schedule. So we find what really helps them based on their lifestyle. And it's, again, is an individual script for each person.
Mm. And going along with that, you've mentioned time and time again the tests. Can we talk a little bit about the tests that you recommend have done?
Sure, absolutely. So we're looking at thyroid function. The tests that are covered via Medicare is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Usually there's no problem getting the thyroid stimulating hormone done. But we'd also want to look at, even if thyroid stimulating hormone is normal, we want to look at their free T4 levels and free T3 levels. That's, again, the T4 is, the 4 iodine bonds that represent the thyroid hormone. T3 is the more active of the two, and we want to see how the T4 is converting into T3. And at Sharkey's over the years, what I've done is I've looked at patients who have become pregnant and then looked at what their baseline levels were prior to becoming pregnant, as close to the pregnancy as we've had them. And then on average, we take 100 pregnancies a year and average them out and find what is the optimal level, because they're usually always within normal range, but our optimal ranges are a little bit tighter. So we then shoot for that particular range. But when looking at T3, that can be, you can look at that as given optimal range, but if most of the T3 that's being made is reverse T3 or inactive T3, then that's going to tell us that there, again, is some stressors on the system that is not allowing the T4 to convert to active T3. So in that case, we would look at reverse T3 being tested as well. And then, of course, the thyroid antibodies, we look at the antithyroid peroxidase and the thyroglobulin, antithyroid thyroglobulin antibodies be tested to look at the issues with whether there's a Hashimotos type situation or autoimmune issues starting.
Yeah.
So those are the main ones that I would do for thyroid. And then when I look at adrenals, I usually look at your DHEA levels in the blood. But more accurately, I like to look at the cortisol levels in the saliva because it gives us the rhythm of cortisol throughout the day. So 4 tests in the morning, mid-morning, afternoon, and evening to look at how cortisol is traveling throughout the day and if it's in the best rhythm that it can be. And then the DHEA levels, which also is indicative of adrenal function as well.
Yeah.
So those are the main ones, and maybe a few others that I throw in there as well.
With the salivary cortisol, do you find, we've got a diurnal variation on one day, but do you find, say, cyclical changes throughout a cycle? If you did a daily cortisol at the beginning of the cycle versus the middle of the cycle, the end?
That's a great question. I've been looking at that over the years. What I do, along with looking at cortisol levels during the cycle, I would most likely test that in a woman who has a very difficult cycle. So
Right.
She's very fatigued during that time. She has significant premenstrual. If she's really fatigued premenstrually, I might do it then. If she has some significant adrenal or thyroid symptoms that are happening around her cycle, I absolutely would test that during that time. Typically, I ask that the thyroid be tested during the cycle if possible, during menstruation if possible, because that's just generally more stress on the system. So I don't necessarily always want to do cortisol during that time because that may kind of influence what the cortisol levels might be depending on how much stress their menstrual cycle might be putting on the system. So it doesn't give us, in my opinion, a great baseline. So I might look at that outside, or usually I should say look at that outside of menstruation. Mm-hmm. But occasionally, depending on, again, what the patient presents to me in regards to their period, I might do that also during menstruation. But I typically try to do the thyroid hormones during menstruation to see how their body is handling that extra stress in the system, even if they're asymptomatic.
Yeah. What about men, Stacey? Like, how important is it for men to have their adrenals and thyroid monitored or at least questioned?
Absolutely essential. I mean, especially if they're coming to me for fertility issues and there's issues with the sperm count in particular, right. Because we know that thyroid influences sperm production, and if there's a low level of sperm or low sperm count, there we want to assess whether the thyroid is influencing that. The thyroid stimulates testosterone production. T3 stimulates testosterone production. So if there's low levels of free testosterone, potentially that could be related to thyroid issues. Could also be related to other things as well. But it is huge. And when we see elevated cortisol levels in men from, again, increased stress, whether that's physiological stress or emotional stress that's creating physiological stress, that has also been correlated with lower testosterone levels, which again, in some men can correlate with a lower sperm count. And then we look at the quality of the sperm, like sperm motility or the sperm morphology, the abnormal versus normal forms of sperm. If there's increased stress in the system, which might be causing some gut issues, where they've got leaky gut or poor absorption of nutrients into the system, they're not going to be getting the nutrients into the cells that they need to optimize sperm quality as well too, not just quantity. So both of those aspects are important. So we look at how men are handling their stressors, and they tend to not be as I don't want to say open to, but tend not to be as aware of their stressors. 70% of the couples in there will say, he handles stress better than I do, or she gets more stressed out than I do.
Yeah.
Again, very stereotypical, but it's what I've seen over the years. But he, again, may be handling his stress from an emotional point of view in one way, and thinking he's not stressed. But then when we look at his testosterone levels or his thyroid levels or his cortisol or DHA, there's evidence of stressors on. And again, that may not be emotional stress, but it might be some physiological stress caused by what they're eating, what they're drinking in regards to alcohol consumption, what they're exposed to at work, maybe creating physiological stress that could be causing elevated levels of cortisol over a long period of time, which then could create issues with their fertility. I'll tell you one story about a guy, physiological and environmental point of view, while he was impacted by chemicals that he was exposed to at work. The couple came to me, and they had a 2-year-old boy, and they were having trouble becoming pregnant again. So they were diagnosed with secondary infertility. So she came to see me, and he came along, and I asked, have you had a semen analysis? And they said, well, no, because we have one child already. The doctor said it couldn't be with me. So I said, well, let's just be sure that everything's going the way that it should, and sent them away for a semen analysis. I didn't see them then for about 6 months, and they came back to me. Well, what happened was he came back with no sperm, 0 sperm in the ejaculate. Wow. And he thought she cheated on him and to have their first child. So he had because the doctor said, well, you must have not ever had, not ever have been creating sperm at all. So they went through the paternity test, and they, confirmed that it was his child and everything. Well, as we look back in his history, when they came back to me to try to figure out what the heck happened, about a year or 2 years, maybe about 18 months, I think it was, before his first child was born, he took a new job in the landscaping business where he was exposed to chemicals. Yeah. Now it's 2 or 3 or 4 years later of that exposure on an everyday basis that basically shut down his sperm production. And once he was able to move himself away from that, and we did some good, cleanses and stuff like that, it took us about 12 to 14 months, I think it was. Yeah. The sperm production came back again, and they were able to create another child. But it's so essential to look at the guy's point of view, even if it's a secondary fertility issue. We always want to assess the gentleman's side of things, because the sperm doesn't just fertilize the egg, it also helps to develop that embryo into a viable pregnancy. So we want to make sure that all the parameters are as optimal as they can be.
Stacey, thank you for that example. I think that's a poignant example of just how important it is for patients to communicate clearly and openly with their practitioner. I want to move quickly over to just a few things that you might employ. I know this is a big topic, but what are the common things that you might employ when treating infertility in both males and females?
Sure. Well, we discussed, the nutritional components. We discussed selenium and iodine, but zinc and chromium are also really, really important in regards to that conversion from T4 to T3 as well. And from a male fertility aspect, we already know that zinc is very important for sperm production. So the other things that I would utilize in a herbal formula, just again in general, because there's so many different things that you can utilize. I tend to utilize withania and bacopa due to the studies that show that can promote T4 levels if I see that the T4 levels are low. I might, if it's adrenally related, I'll look at the adaptogens, which again, withania is an adaptogen as well as Rehmannia and rhodiola. Those can be really beneficial when you're looking at kind of a combination of the thyroid and adrenals working together. Yep. So that's kind of in general where I would be focused on, then, looking at the whole person, bringing in other herbs that might be necessary as well. Glad factor as well, too, if I'm looking at potentially supporting iodine as well.
Blue flag, do you ever use that?
Blue flag, I don't use that as much, but I will use that in some cases. Yeah. And also the bladder act too, I should mention that's also a great detoxifier. It can be really beneficial for heavy metal detoxifying as well too. So that's another reason that I would use that depending on their occupation or exposure. Yeah.
And indeed, how prevalent, how often do you employ, comprehensive detox to get rid of chemicals and toxins and things like that?
I tend to go in phases because I'm always really cognizant of what kind of money that the patients are wanting them to, and I want to be as cost effective for them as I possibly can. Mm-hmm. So we'll start with simple things like their eating plan first, which isn't really going to cost them significantly more unless they completely change to an organic eating plan than they weren't before. So we'll start with the basics in regards to their eating plan. Then if I know that they've grown up on a farm and have had exposures, or they're working in a factory where they're maybe heavy metal exposures, we'll talk about that detoxification process more in detail for them, maybe to get some testing done for heavy metals and things closer to the beginning. But all the while, I'm thinking liver detoxification and supporting that detoxification process all the while anyway, just for promoting optimal health. But I might get much more specific and put them on more of a cleanse than the detox, I call it, something a little bit more gentle, because you don't want to create more stress in the system when someone's trying to become pregnant. So I do a gentle cleanse that I would take them through if necessary, if that's what they're presenting with, and they need more of a phase 1 and 2 liver detox program.
Mm-hmm. Stacey, there's one other nutrient I do want to just ask you about quickly, and that's Coenzyme Q10. I remember Ruth Trickey speaking about Coenzyme Q10 on the basis of one pilot trial. She employed it quite successfully in infertile couples. How important is it? And tell us where the evidence is now.
It's extremely important. It's something that right now, you hear, depending on the dosage, you'll hear 300 milligrams might be, best. But what it does is promote optimal mitochondrial, energy production basically in the cell, to give the cell a bit more energy. And one of the things that they say in regards to age-related fertility is that, the older a woman is, the less energy that egg has to be able to produce a healthy embryo. So they're looking at coenzyme Q10 in different studies to try to boost the energy. There's also another supplement called PQQ, so that's Peter and then quarter, that when taken together with coenzyme Q10 actually has been shown to increase the number of mitochondria in cells. So I tend to, with women who are more mature trying to become pregnant, I will combine the coenzyme Q10 with the PQQ to be able to promote not just a more efficient mitochondrial production of energy, but also to increase the amount of mitochondria in the cells, which clearly would be beneficial in increasing the energy and the health of the cells as well. So it's a very, very important nutrient as well too. And women who have thyroid issues and men who have thyroid issues too, fatigue is a big part of it. When you get them on good levels of coenzyme Q10, there's many times a noticeable difference in their energy and overall health, which then makes them want to exercise more, and then that helps with regulating their weight as well too.
Stacey, thank you so much for taking it. That's a huge topic. I mean,
it is.
And that's only one chapter of such a huge topic.
Absolutely, you could do a 4 to 6 hour talk just on the thyroid, and we brought in, so many different aspects into it as well. So I hope the listeners get a good kind of overall perspective of what they can and should be looking for in general regarding the thyroid and adrenals and the autoimmune system, and hopefully have on a few tidbits in this talk that they can take away and apply to their practice as well.
Well, I absolutely know they will. There are so many things that I learnt just in that brief talk with you, and I look forward to us doing further podcasts in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. I do too. Thank you so much again for having me.
Oh, my absolute pleasure, Stacey. This is FX Radio, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.